Emily Rhodes was the smiling babysitter every neighbor swore they could trust, and Noah Parker was the 6-month-old baby she was hired to keep safe. But when a single night ended with his skull fractured and a 911 call that raised more questions than answers, their names became forever tied to one of the darkest crimes the suburb had ever seen. Emily Rhodes was the kind of teenager every parent wanted to have around. At 19, she had already created a reputation in Brookfield as the reliable babysitter. Families recommended her to one another, passing her name around at school meetings, church gatherings, and neighborhood events. She was always available on short notice, never complained about long hours, and kept a sweet, gentle smile that instantly reassured anxious parents. To many, she seemed like the perfect role model for younger kids, responsible, calm, and caring. Mothers spoke of how she read bedtime stories with patience. Fathers mentioned how she tidied up the house after putting children to bed, and little ones clung to her when she left, begging their parents to invite her back. On the surface, Emily seemed flawless. But behind her soft voice and trustworthy presence, there was something darker, something carefully hidden. People who saw her every day never questioned it. Neighbors noticed that she kept mostly to herself when she wasn't babysitting. She didn't hang out with friends, she wasn't involved in college, and she rarely shared details about her personal life. Instead, she lived off the steady stream of babysitting jobs, earning money and gaining trust with each family that called her. Parents often spoke of how lucky they were to have found someone like her, and they never hesitated to leave their most precious loved ones in her care. No one realized that Emily's calm demeanor had cracks beneath the surface. She was good at pretending, skilled at hiding the short temper that sometimes flared when she was alone with children who wouldn't stop crying. The quiet streets of Brookfield had no idea they were nurturing a predator in plain sight, someone whose mask of innocence was about to slip in the most horrifying way imaginable. The Parker family had been planning their evening out for weeks. Jacob and Hannah Parker were new parents, exhausted from sleepless nights and the constant demands of caring for their 6-month-old son, Noah. They rarely had time alone together anymore, and this dinner reservation was meant to give them a brief escape from their routine. When the question of who would watch Noah came up, the answer was easy. They immediately thought of Emily Rhodes. She had looked after him before, and everything had always gone smoothly. Her reputation as the most dependable babysitter in the neighborhood made the choice seem effortless. That Saturday evening, Emily arrived right on time, her hair neatly tied back and a smile fixed across her face. She greeted the Parkers warmly and assured them she would take care of everything. Hannah gave a few last-minute instructions while Jacob placed Noah gently in Emily's arms. The baby fussed but quickly settled, a moment that made the parents feel at ease. They grabbed their coats, exchanged quick goodbyes, and walked out the door believing their son was in safe hands. Inside the Parker home, Emily looked around with quiet satisfaction. The tidy living room, the soft glow of the lamp, the baby monitor resting on the table, it all reflected the trust this family had placed in her. To anyone watching, she appeared calm and composed, the ideal babysitter ready for a quiet evening. But Emily's mind was not as serene as her outward appearance suggested. Hours stretched long in the silence of the house, and with each passing minute, her patience thinned. What began as a routine night of babysitting would soon unravel into something far darker, leaving a mark on the Parker family that would never fade. As the evening settled into silence, the Parker home became heavy with the restless cries of baby Noah. At first, the sounds were ordinary, the kind of fussing every infant goes through when tired or hungry. Emily paced the room, rocking him in her arms, whispering softly as if she were the picture of patience. But as the minutes turned into hours, the cries grew louder, sharper, and more piercing. What should have been manageable began gnawing at her nerves, turning the calm atmosphere into one filled with irritation. Neighbors would later recall hearing the faint sound of a baby crying long after the Parkers had left. At the time, it didn't seem unusual, every baby cries. But inside those walls, Emily was beginning to lose control. She had always prided herself on being dependable, but in truth, her tolerance had limits she rarely revealed. Tonight, Noah's constant wailing began pulling at those limits until frustration boiled into anger. The baby's tiny fists waved in the air, his red face contorted with distress, and Emily's composure started to crack. What parents saw as her gentle patience was nothing more than an act she performed for others. Alone in the Parker household, the performance ended. Each shrill cry felt like an attack on her calm, each restless movement feeding her growing resentment. When the crying suddenly stopped, the quiet seemed almost unnatural, the kind of silence that chills rather than comforts. By then, something irreversible had happened. What had started as a normal evening of babysitting had turned into a nightmare unfolding behind closed doors. Outside, the streetlights glowed peacefully, but inside, an infant's life was hanging by a thread, and the trusted babysitter's mask of innocence was beginning to shatter. Close to midnight, the stillness of the Parker home was broken by a call placed to emergency services. Emily's trembling voice filled the line, describing what she claimed was a tragic accident. She told the dispatcher that Noah had slipped from her arms and struck his head on the floor. Her words were rushed, her breathing uneven, painting the image of a panicked babysitter who had witnessed a heartbreaking mishap. Within minutes, flashing lights illuminated the quiet street as paramedics rushed inside, finding Emily clutching the infant with tears streaming down her face. Noah was unresponsive, his tiny body limp, his breathing shallow. The team quickly began their life-saving efforts, placing him on a stretcher and preparing him for the hospital. Emily stood nearby, shaking and sobbing, repeating her explanation of the fall. To the paramedics, she looked distraught, but even in those chaotic moments, something about the scene didn't sit right. The injury appeared far too severe for the story she was giving. Police officers soon arrived, noting every detail of the environment. The living room floor, the baby blanket nearby, the hard surfaces that Emily pointed to, all were documented. At first glance, it could have been an accident, but suspicion crept in when one officer whispered quietly to another that the injury seemed inconsistent with her story. As the ambulance pulled away with Noah fighting for his life, Emily remained behind, her face pale and her hands trembling. Onlookers might have seen her as a devastated young woman overwhelmed by tragedy. But to the trained eyes of investigators, the cracks in her version of events were already beginning to show. The 911 call, meant to save her from blame, had instead set in motion an investigation that would soon uncover the truth. At the hospital, doctors and nurses worked frantically to stabilize Noah. Machines beeped steadily as specialists examined his fragile body, their expressions growing darker with every test result. A scan revealed the grim reality. His skull had been fractured with alarming force. This was not the kind of injury expected from a short fall onto a carpeted floor. The damage was extensive, and the angle of the fracture suggested something violent had taken place. The medical team documented every detail, knowing their findings would be crucial. Child abuse cases were always treated with urgency, and this one raised immediate red flags. Reports were filed to law enforcement before dawn, and detectives were notified that the situation was far from accidental. What Emily had described during her frantic 911 call simply did not match the evidence before them. While Noah remained under intensive care, detectives began piecing together the story. They spoke with the doctors, who carefully explained that the force required to create such a fracture could not be explained by a simple drop. It would have taken a deliberate action, something more violent than Emily's story suggested. Each observation strengthened the suspicion that the trusted babysitter was hiding something terrible. Meanwhile, the Parkers arrived at the hospital, devastated and clinging to hope. They had left their child in the hands of someone they believed was trustworthy, only to be met with the news that his injuries were critical. In another room, Emily sat with investigators, her head bowed and her hands fidgeting nervously. She repeated her version of events, but every word she spoke only deepened the divide between her story and the medical evidence. The image of the perfect babysitter was unraveling, and suspicion was quickly turning into certainty. Detectives turned their attention to Emily's past, determined to understand whether this night had been a tragic one-time event or part of a disturbing pattern. They began contacting the families who had hired her over the past 2 years, and what they uncovered painted a far more troubling picture than anyone expected. Several parents admitted that while Emily had seemed dependable, they had occasionally noticed strange injuries on their children after nights she babysat. Tiny bruises on arms, odd scratches, and unexplained bumps had been brushed aside at the time as clumsy accidents. None of them had reported their suspicions, fearing they might be overreacting or unfairly accusing someone so well-liked in the neighborhood. The investigation revealed that Emily had built her spotless reputation on charm and convenience. She was always available, often stepping in when other sitters canceled at the last minute. Parents appreciated her reliability and rarely questioned her methods. But as detectives pieced together these testimonies, a disturbing pattern emerged. Emily had a history of being alone with children who later showed signs of minor but suspicious injuries. Her own background provided little comfort either. Records showed she had been an isolated teenager, with few close friends and strained relationships at home. Teachers described her as quiet but easily frustrated under pressure, a detail that suddenly seemed more significant. The mask of a responsible, cheerful babysitter was giving way to the portrait of someone who had long struggled with hidden anger. For investigators, the evidence from Noah's case was no longer standing alone. It was part of a chain of troubling incidents that had simply gone unnoticed. The community that once praised Emily's reliability was about to face the shocking truth about the person they had trusted most with their children. Forensic teams were called into the Parker home to re-examine every detail. What they found stripped away the last threads of Emily's carefully constructed story. Blood traces were discovered on the edge of the coffee table, and the pattern of the stain matched perfectly with the location of Noah's head wound. The shape and placement made it clear that this was not the result of an accidental slip. Experts concluded that Noah had been struck with force, either by being slammed against the surface or by being thrown. The explanation of a baby slipping from her arms and falling onto the floor no longer held any weight. Detectives confronted Emily with the evidence, but she clung tightly to her original version, insisting she had done nothing intentional. Yet her behavior betrayed her. Her answers grew inconsistent, her emotions swinging from weeping fits to eerie calmness. Investigators noted her lack of genuine concern for Noah's condition, as her focus remained on defending herself rather than on whether the child would survive. The shift in her demeanor was impossible to ignore. The 911 call, which at first seemed like the desperate cry of a panicked babysitter, now appeared to be part of a cover-up. Investigators believed Emily had immediately realized the severity of what she had done and had tried to mask it as a tragic accident. Her trembling voice on the recording, once a symbol of distress, was now analyzed as an attempt at deception. With the forensic evidence, medical reports, and testimonies from other families, prosecutors felt confident they were building an airtight case. What began as suspicion had hardened into certainty. The truth was clear. Emily Rhodes had not been a victim of circumstance. She had been the cause of Noah's suffering. The trial of Emily Rhodes gripped the entire community, transforming the once quiet suburb of Brookfield into the center of national attention. Courtrooms filled with reporters, parents, and neighbors who could hardly believe the girl they had trusted for years was now accused of a crime so brutal. Prosecutors laid out the timeline in chilling detail, presenting the medical findings that proved Noah's injuries were caused by deliberate force. The blood evidence from the living room table, the inconsistencies in Emily's statements, and the testimonies from families who recalled unexplained bruises on their children all painted a devastating picture. The defense attempted to argue that Emily had panicked after an accident and exaggerated her story out of fear. They highlighted her young age, her lack of prior convictions, and her reputation as a responsible babysitter. But the evidence was too overwhelming to ignore. Doctors testified about the nature of the injury, emphasizing that the level of trauma could not have been caused by a minor fall. Jurors listened intently, their faces hardening with every detail that undermined Emily's claims. The Parkers sat in silence throughout the proceedings, holding hands, their grief etched into every expression. They had left their son in the care of someone they believed to be safe, only to discover that trust had been betrayed in the worst possible way. When the verdict was finally read, guilty on charges of aggravated child abuse and attempted murder, the courtroom fell silent before a wave of emotion swept through. Emily was sentenced to decades in prison, her mask of innocence forever shattered. For the community, the case served as a haunting reminder that evil can wear the face of familiarity. The trusted babysitter had become the monster no one saw coming, leaving behind scars that would never fully heal.